We're generally, as a species, pretty bad at looking past the end of our noses and understanding what's going on.
Hello, and welcome to Promote the Hell Out of It. My name is Ms. Trujillo, and on this show I have conversations with people worth promoting about concepts, creators, and causes worth knowing about. I am back with Season 2, and I am so excited to share all my new guests with you. This week, I have the absolute privilege of talking to Dr. Matt Lodder. He is Senior Lecturer in Art History and Theory at the University of Essex, and his research primarily concerns tattoos and also body modification, although that is really understating his experience. He is also Director of American Studies at the university. He teaches European, American, and Japanese art, architecture, visual culture, and that is all just from what I can find on the university website, and from reading some of his interviews, I know that he is also an expert on a lot of other subjects. But this conversation was absolutely wonderful. I can't even begin to explain what a great privilege it was for me to listen to some of the accounts that we got to talk about, to some examples of tattooing that I had no idea about, and to also get a broader idea of how tattooing fits into society as a whole, and whether society's views of tattoos are changing, have ever changed, or will ever change. I really hope you enjoy this conversation, and please do check out all of Matt's links below, and also specifically the links to the exhibition he currently has on, which is British Tattoo Art Revealed. It's on the road, and I highly recommend checking it out. So yeah, without any more ado, here is my conversation with Dr. Matt Lodder.
We're generally, as a species, pretty bad at looking past the end of our noses and understanding what's going on.
Matt, I am so happy to have you on the show. I've been really excited to do this. How are you?
I'm really good, thanks for having me.
No, it's an absolute pleasure. I've got to say, I've been absolutely looking forward to this because your area of expertise is something that has fascinated me since I was very young. And I think specifically my view of tattoos and body modification specifically has played such a vital role in growing up and the way I view the world. So this is a conversation that I think is really important, and I'm looking forward to.
Oh, great, thank you.
So to start off with a massive cliche, right? I grew up in an uber religious household, and what my dad told me about tattoos growing up was that they were for bikers, convicts, ex-military, pagans, hippies, and punks. And I might have missed a few things of that list. Now, was I alone in thinking that whilst growing up, or was this a shared point of view?
I mean, that's actually a broader range than the cliche usually goes. So you probably had quite a expansive education if we're adding pagans in there. So one of the things I collect as a tattoo historian is examples of that cliche, right? So the media particularly sort of telling their audience that tattoos were like, hey, you thought that tattoos were just for sailors, just for bikers, just for criminals. But hey, guess what? Like, the king's getting tattooed now, or oh my God, Cora, women are getting tattooed now, right? So the idea that tattoos were for one kind of person and are now, whenever we're talking about when now was, for a different kind of person, is a really, really old, pervasive cliche. So the earliest example that I found goes back to, I mean, even before there were tattoo shops really, so back to the sort of 1860s, 1870s. And I found examples for every single decade in the last 140 years that says, hey, you thought tattoos were only just for one kind of person, but hey, guess what? Everyone's doing it. I mean, I found one. My favourite one of those was from 1982, so just after I was born, a couple of years after I was born. And it said, it was in a London magazine, and it said, hey, if you think that tattoos are just for hepatitis-ridden prostitutes and Victorian freak shows, you're way out of date, because housewives and university lecturers are getting tattooed now, right? And that was 40 years ago. So you weren't alone. I mean, you weren't alone in a kind of century and a half of myth and misunderstanding.
That's ridiculous. Why do you think it continued so long? Because obviously it's been said for that long. Why did it continue to be that myth?
Well, I mean, on the one hand, journalists are lazy. I think really the fundamental thing that it comes down to, right, and maybe this is at the root of your own experience, is that tattoos they do divide people, but they don't divide people in the way that people who aren't tattooed imagine. Really, the divide is people who sort of understand tattooing, who understand that desire to mark your body forever. And those who don't get it, and those who don't get it and are confused about it and think it's weird, are the ones who are writing the articles in the newspapers about it. I mean, talking about in a Western context here, non-Western tattooing's different, of course, but in a Western context, really, the journalists who are writing about this are like, "Oh, this is weird. Well, why is everyone getting tattooed all of a sudden?" But of course, those of us that are tattooed sort of don't find it strange at all. I've called it an empathy gap, I think, when I've written about this before, Like, it's really, you either get it or you don't, in some sense.
No, that I can completely relate to that, because that's how I viewed it. The reason tattoos in my family were such taboo is because I was brought up a Jehovah's Witness, and you had to go door knocking. And the point of view was, well, if you've got a tattoo, they're going to think you're one of, and then it goes back to that list. and all of those things have negative connotations depending on the person who's on the other side of the door.
Yeah.
Now, from where I was standing, that wasn't how it worked at all. Tattoos made me realize that I should treat everyone the same because physical differences weren't that important, which is a really different side to come at it from.
There's something about tattooing which just confuses people, because it breaks a kind of particular sense in how Western culture wants us to think about our bodies, right? So it involves voluntarily undergoing pain. It involves being touched by a stranger. It involves kind of breaking our relationship with the present and the past in kind of quite an uncomfortable way for a lot of people. That's that kind of what will you do when you're older kind of question. And it just works in a slightly abrasive way against everything that we, in a lot of cultural norms in mainstream Western culture. I mean, I had the same. So when I was growing up, I've told this story a lot, but my sort of secret superhero origin story of becoming a tattoo aficionado or tattoo collector or whatever you want to call it was I got told two stories right when I was a kid, both of which were supposed to ward me off being tattooed. One was that my great granddad one was that my great grandma was tattooed. She'd been tattooed around about 1900. She was about 15, and her little brother had come home one day with a tattoo machine. I've since found out that, at least for a very short time around that period, you could basically buy tattoo machines from a toy shop. There was a big toy shop in London with old tattoo machines. And my great uncle, however he got one, came home one day and said to my great grandma, like, "Hey, can I tattoo you?" And she said, "Will it come off?" And he said, "Yes, of course it will come off." So she had her whole life, her initials tattooed on her wrist, right? And obviously she hated it because she didn't want it. It was she felt particularly stigmatized as a woman in Victorian Australia. And then the other story was that my granddad, who was a submariner in the Dutch Navy, he told me that he woke up in a tattooist's chair in Jakarta as he was about to get a fly tattooed on the end of his nose. He was on his rum ration, and it was only the buzzing of the tattoo machine which woke him up and saved him from that fate, right? So, so I think there is a real anxiety, I think, amongst people who haven't got tattoos to see the whole practice is quite threatening and quite stigmatizing and quite strange. But we're in this weird feedback loop that really sort of started in, I don't know, the late 19th century criminology, right, which sort of said that what we read on people's bodies was something to do with their character, right? I mean, all the kind of criminology and racism and racial eugenics and racial science, which sort of characterized the first decades of the 20th century, that really begins, and it includes tattooing. One criminologist famously said, tattoos are the stigmata of the criminal man. If a tattooed man dies at liberty, it was only a matter of time before he would have committed a crime, right? So if you've got a tattoo, you're a criminal, and if you're not a criminal, well, you just died before you got caught. And of course, all that does is then perpetuate these ideas in the minds of people who sort of find the whole idea a bit strange to begin with.
Incredibly, yeah. It's something that I wanted to lead the conversation onto, and it's kind of led perfectly, which is how much representation there is of tattoos linking to lower class. There seems to be, as far back as I can think, even though I personally found it attractive or cool when I was younger, but a lot of the representation was lower class people, as if it was a negative connotation because of that. Do you think that that's been something that's been done on purpose?
Well, it's not on purpose, but I mean, so how old are you, if you don't mind me asking?
I'm 30.
Okay, so you're about 10 years younger than me. So there's an interesting reason for that, and it's also a sort of interesting self-perpetuating problem. And it's to do with the visibility of tattooing, right? I mean, the literal visibility of tattooing. So most tattoos are under clothing. So most tattoos you just do not see. And certainly in the earlier parts of... So professional tattooing in the West begins in about the 1880s, right? And certainly at that time, and really through until pretty recently, I mean, certainly up to the Second World War, it wasn't really the done thing to be showing off a lot of skin if you were at work, right? Or even particularly if you're a woman anyway. So if you were a man and you were a bank manager, or you were a captain in the army, or you were a businessman of some kind, and you had a tattoo, even on your arm, it just wouldn't ever be seen unless you chose to show it off, right? There are stories of Lord Lonsdale, the guy after whom the Lonsdale clothing brand is named. He used to roll his fully tattooed sleeves up at parties in the 1920s because you just didn't even roll your sleeves up, let alone show your tattoos off. There's a woman who I've talked about a bit as well in previous interviews, a woman called Edie, who was Marchioness of Londonderry.
Yeah, I was reading about that today.
Yeah, you know about that. She's got a whacking great tattoo of a dragon on her leg and her family crest on the other leg in about 1900. And then, no one saw it because it wasn't the done thing to be flashing your ankles. But it wasn't until the 1930s when skirt heights went up a little bit and everyone was like, oh my God, you've got a tattoo on your leg. And in macro, that's what happens really in the modern moment. So we don't really get... I mean, there's sort of a skepticism or a confusion with tattooing before that, but the real stigma that tattooing is kind of a negative thing doesn't really kick in at full speed, at least in Britain, until the 1950s.
Okay.
And what's happening in the 50s is there's lots of tattooed people around because war is quite a good time or common time for people to get tattooed. Lots of tattooing happening of all social classes and of both genders. But the tattoos that were visible after the war, right, were not the people that returned from the front, from fighting and went into professional careers. They were the people who were digging the roads.
Yeah.
So all of a sudden, there's this surge in visibility of tattooing, but it's only on certain kinds of people. It's only on people whose bodies are visible, and that really is what drives, I think, a lot of that. People of your generation and my generation, that kind of anxiety, it was fed into our parents' generations. My parents were born in the baby boomers, born in the 1940s. And so the tattoos that they included as young kids were always on people whose bodies were visible to them, and that's generally manual workers, right? So that problem continues in a way. There are... Tattooing is really expensive, I'm sure you well know. And so people who are getting the biggest tattoos, like back pieces and full coverage, tend, not exclusively, but tend to be, earning some decent money most of the time. But of course, it's still pretty difficult if you're a high court judge or a lawyer or a barrister or a head teacher or a bank manager to present yourself as fully tattooed. I mean, that's changing a little bit, partly because we're a bit more relaxed about clothing. We just show off a lot more skin in general than we used to, so more tattoos are visible, and that's breaking the stigma a bit. But it's the tattoos that you see, that we see as a culture, that form our sense of who gets tattooed.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that brings up something really interesting for me, which I think is obviously starting to change. And I think social media and how prevalent and easy it is to take photos of everything now has helped. But for a long time, I think if someone was very tattooed, and I'm talking about you could see it over their suit, for example, then the amount of money that was required for that often pinpointed to criminality. That's at least what my parents would have said, or my grandparents would have said. And I think that's not been helped by things like films, where you've got, obviously, sometimes you've got all the cartels are fully fully tattooed up, and that's that kind of image that gets portrayed.
Yeah, that gets to be a nice little visual shortcut, right? Which is again how visual stereotypes work. I mean, there's quite a few good little Merry Melodies cartoons from the 1930s of circuses and sideshows and stuff, which always feature the tattooed strongman and stuff. There's also so that visual image, of the tattooed sailor, of the tattooed outsider, and is pretty visible. And I think you also have to understand that it's also true, right? Like it's not true that like criminals and sailors didn't get tattooed. It's just that other people tattooed as well. so in a way, there's always a little kernel of truth to this stuff. I mean, I think a lot of what's really interesting, actually, particularly in cultures. So the most, I guess, visually arresting and certainly most kind of culturally ingrained association between gangs and tattooing is in Japan, with the Yakuza and other Japanese criminal organizations. And in recent decades, they've sort of basically stopped getting tattooed as much because like marking yourself out as a criminal isn't that useful. If you're actually kind of trying to get away with crime, making yourself really visible as a criminal doesn't really help. So even in cultures where there was a really kind of strong association, very, very strong, almost kind of, I mean, this is true in Russia too, actually, places where there are very particular associations between criminal gangs and tattooing, which hasn't really happened in Britain to the same degree. But even in those places, it's changing,
Yeah, no, I think that's what I've seen as well, because I've got a lot of friends who went to Japan and I spent some time in Asia. And even some of the places we went where previously tattoos hadn't been as accepted, now people were coming up and really like being excited about my tattoos and pointing them out and asking questions about them. So it is changing worldwide, the point of view. Yeah. And I think that's a good thing, obviously, but it's taken its time.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I sort of I want to caution a bit on that because I also think, because people often say to me, tattoos are so sort of safe now and so acceptable. And I sort of don't want to fall into that same trap of, what we were talking about earlier on, of the 140 years of like, tattoo, everyone's doing it now kind of. Because I think there is something quite basically transgressive about tattooing that's always going to make it, I think there's always going to be more people who find tattooing that's not something not for them or even something problematic than there are people that want to do it. So I think, the example I've been given, and maybe it's changing slightly, but in the period I've been talking about it, but David Beckham's a really good example, right? So David Beckham really, certainly if he didn't kind of inspire people to get tattooed, he certainly kind of led people in the kind of tattoos they were getting. Very tattoos on his hands, tattoos on his neck, on TV adverts and billboards for Sainsbury's, right? For a while, he was the face of Sainsbury's. Probably would have a hard job getting hired as a manager of a Sainsbury's store, right? With his tattoos in his hands, and certainly would have a hard time getting onto the board of Sainsbury's. If he wasn't David Beckham, if he was just some random dude with tattoos in his hands. So you're right to say that things are changing, and you're right to say that things are getting more liberal, to use that word. But I think ultimately it's always going to be a bit weird, and I always want to, in a weird way, pull back from that sort of like, everything's great now idea, because I think it's also going to be always more complicated than that.
Absolutely. And do you think that that's because the representation of tattoos has affected both sides, not only people that don't like tattoos, but I think that people that do have tattoos instinctively generally stay away from certain areas that they don't like. And I'm referring to, for example, people who I know that are tattooists or love tattoos are generally pretty skeptical of law, of education, of those kind of jobs, and wouldn't even want to go into them generally. Does that make any sense?
I see what you mean. And I mean, there is a sort of, because the very act is in itself transgressive, there is something, revelatory about the act of getting tattooed, I think, in some degree. But then you have to remember, with a heavy heart, that people like Samantha Cameron and James Murdoch, Rupert Murdoch's son, who runs the Times, like they also have tattoos. I mean, they're not heavily tattooed, but they have gotten tattooed. So yeah, you are correct to some degree, certainly. And this is also, one of the things I think is interesting about tattooing from a historical and sort of social point of view, which sort of gets misunderstood, right, is the degree to which like it is driven by it's not a kind of social contagion insofar as like people who wouldn't have ever thought about getting a tattoo are now going out and getting them to a great degree, but the kind of trends in tattooing and the visibility of tattooing of certain kinds does change the kind of tattoos people get. So I think people are getting certainly at the moment bigger tattoos. They're getting more visible tattoos. I mean, we're just aside from the kind of rolled up sleeves at work thing we were just talking about, like people are getting their hands tattooed at much more much more frequency than they used to back in the day. And so, and that is a kind of trend, and that is something that is affected by what people see on the internet, but then again, my argument on that would be, well, like, so what? And in a way, that's how we work as human beings, like that's how we choose our clothing, that's how we choose our haircuts, that's how we use our the furniture we sit on, the houses we buy, the colour we paint our kitchens, the cars we drive, all that kind of stuff is all kind of trend driven. And I think when people who don't understand tattooing have written about tattooing as a trend, they mean the act of getting tattooed. But actually, I'm kind of interested in. I'm less interested in why people get tattooed, or even the fact that they do get tattooed at all, but what they're getting tattooed, what the images are, how that kind of relates to their, immediate, emotional and cultural environments. Like I always describe this in my academic work as like, most academics, certainly, and I think probably it's true for journalists too, but certainly most academics who've written about tattooing write about it as a phenomenon. Like the very act of marking the skin is the important thing. So we can kind of analogize someone getting tattooed in a prison, and someone getting a back piece in Japan, and someone getting a full mock-off facial tattoo in New Zealand in the 18th century, and whatever. They think they're all the same because they're all marking of the skin. But actually, tattooing is a medium, right? It's a way of making images. And in the same way as we wouldn't say cave painting and fresco painting and painting the wall of your house with emulsion and, portrait painting in oils are the same thing just because they're done with a brush with paint, that we shouldn't do the same thing with tattooing. But that's always the instinct to do that, Tattooing is a medium, not a phenomenon.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And that brings a lot more into the conversation as well. Because obviously, when you're painting something on a wall or on a canvas, it's there forever, first of all, and also it's very clear whose idea that was and who owns that. Whilst when you're painting on someone else, everything changes, and it's very much the person. It's both people that are creating something together almost, and it's both their points of view of the world that are affecting that.
Right, and that is something that's sort of comprehensible through the language of art history. At least I want to argue that, I suppose, and it's not something which like sociologists of tattooing have particularly noticed. the fact that there are kind of there are all these kind of complex interactions going on. So yeah, you're exactly right. So. The standard account of tattooing, actually positive and negative. So the negative, like criminological account, is that stigmata of the criminal man thing, right? That your tattoo reveals something about the rottenness of your soul. The positive account has been by sort of psychologists who've sort of said, tattoos are the anchor of the postmodern self. We live in crazy worlds and everything's changing so fast, and so we're getting tattoos to kind of fix our identity or communicate something about our identity. And actually, the truth is much more complicated than that, as you allude to, right? It's actually this kind of conversation that we're having with the world, unless we're tattooing ourselves, which does happen, but not to a great extent. There is always someone else involved, right? There's always a tattoo artist involved, and the images you're picking have got some either subcultural or macrocultural context. And it's like, seems really weird to me, and it's almost a nice open goal for me as an art historian of tattooing, but also why the book I've been working on forever hasn't come out yet, because it's taken me so damn long. No one else seems to have noticed this. There are whole books by sociologists about tattooing which don't talk about tattoo artists at all, which I find completely wild.
Yeah, that doesn't make sense. That doesn't make any sense at all.
Yeah.
Okay, so with that in mind, what is needed for that to start to change? Is it already happening because of being able to tag tattoo artists in on social media?
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I think so. I think so. I think Instagram actually, particularly Pinterest to some degree too, but certainly Instagram, Facebook, and maybe even MySpace before that, has started to change how people think about the ownership of a tattoo image, right? So of course, tattooists always had portfolios in their shops. When I was starting out getting tattooed in the late 90s, early 2000s, there was just literally physically printed out photographs in a book. So that kind of format isn't that new. But I think, the understanding that you want to get tattooed, you can follow tattooists online, you can see their work, and it doesn't tell you often even who the tattoo's on. It doesn't give you their life story. It doesn't break down in kind of exhaustive detail whatever we might think the kind of narrative content of that piece is. I think that has helped us shift the understanding of certainly people who are getting tattooed for the first time to understand how tattooing works as an artistic practice, and what the tattooist's role in the whole process might be. Like, that's definitely true. And I think before that stuff was really, it was tattoo magazines. When I was 15, I was coming up to London and buying import tattoo magazines from the US, but before you had to seek that stuff out, and now it's so accessible and so easy. I mean, this is a bigger picture than just tattooing, but I think certainly, you're right that seeing the portfolio of an artist that has a style, that has a kind of artistic sensibility in a way that's more straightforwardly understandable to someone who hasn't been tattooed before. I think that's certainly changing the conversation in some interesting ways. Although I've been a professional tattoo historian for more than 10 years, and a kind of amateur tattoo historian for 20 odds or so. And these cliches still happen. I still get interviewed by journalists, and I do a kind of public lecture a lot, and every time I have to update it, I go and find a recent example, and you will still find, we used to think that tattoos were just for sailors, so things aren't changing, despite me shouting at the top of my lungs, and people like you interviewing me and telling your friends as well, telling your parents, whoever. As I said, I think ultimately there's something pretty kind of baked in our cultural understanding of how this stuff functions, and I don't think that's going anywhere anytime soon. I would not be surprised to still be having conversations with kids in my career.
No, I think that's probably true, because we can see that replicated in a lot of other areas of society. I mean, politically, I wouldn't expect to be having some of the conversations we're still having now after the shit that's gone on in the past. But you still are, and you're still having to convince people. So
well, I think the job of historians in general is to kind of go, actually, the things we think about the present moment that we think are unique perhaps have at least some kind of antecedents and some roots. And that's true of history generally. I think we're generally, as a species, pretty bad at looking past the end of our noses and understanding what's going on, in the world, and certainly what went on in the past. So I'm still going to be I've got. I mean, it's almost comedic now how often I see these we used to think that text. There's in my exhibition that's touring around at the moment. There's a film that your listeners can look up on YouTube. A video called it's called "Painting the Lily." If you get YouTube "Painting the Lily" tattoo, you'll find.
I will link to it. Yeah,
cool. You'll find a little video of film footage of George Burchett, who was the first kind of celebrity tattooer in Britain. He died in the early 1950s, but he was tattooing really for about 40 odd years.
Okay.
50 years. Anyway, in that film, which was filmed in about 1932, literally the opening of that is, we used to think that only sailors patronised the arts, right? and it's a thing about him doing permanent makeup tattooing, and he's tattooing a big dragon on a woman's leg. So, if this has been around for, since the 1920s and 30s, even on video, on film, what hope do the rest of us have in trying to change the narrative,
I get you. Well, with that in mind, why is it so important for you to be involved in that narrative?
Oh, I mean, thank you. That's a really good question. I think so. For me, as I said, I've been in love with tattooing since I was a kid. And when you're a kid, tattooing is magic, essentially, right? Like every kid will kind of at some point in his or her life start doodling on their arms with marker pens, or crayons, and it's so magic when you're a kid that you to see that, but it doesn't rub off. It's really amazing. And so those of us that are heavily tattooed, I think it sounds like you're in the same boat, right? Like fall in love with it very young, and as I got older, I wanted to know more about it, and as I tried to find more about it, I found the things I was reading didn't really accord with the things I was sort of learning from the community. So I've made it my life to kind of try and figure out what the hell's going on. And I think it's interesting, firstly because I always want to be clear what I'm not doing. I'm not trying to kind of rehabilitate tattooing. I don't want to say that all tattooing is great or all tattooing is art, because actually I think some of the work that I'm doing actually allows us to talk about where tattooing is not very good, either aesthetically or ethically. So I'm not trying to kind of say that tattooing is always great. I'm also not trying to kind of, tattooing doesn't need me to rehabilitate it. And I would not even pretend that I'm even capable of doing that, nor that I would want to do it. But for me, I think it is interesting to try and tell these stories because, we, as art history in general, as a method of thinking about the world, says, in general, let's look at the things that people made, right? The paintings and the sculptures and the photographs and the videos and the performances that they've produced and the buildings. And let's try and understand what they were thinking, what it told us about the culture at the time, what it told us that they were hopeful about, what it told us that they feared, what it told us about their prejudice, what it told us about their things they were optimistic about. We can learn basically a lot about people from looking at the art that they produced and the art they consumed. And I think if that's true, which I think is true, if it's true about, the art that hangs in galleries and in churches and big stately mansions, it must be especially true of the images that people carry on their bodies, right? It must be particularly true of the images that people have sat there and endured pain and every second of its production to acquire. So I think, what understanding the history of tattooing does for me is just tell us the history of people, and certainly people whose stories are in general rather absent or certainly mistold or undertold in our mass understanding, and so I think actually understanding where tattooing comes from and how it functions and how it changes over time, and how it has changed over time, and how it will continue to change over time, actually is just a set of bigger stories about social and cultural history and social and cultural attitudes. And particularly because the things that people get tattooed on them tend to be, not exclusively, but tend to be things that are indicative of their very, very, intimate concerns. So they tend to be things like, death, fear, patriotism, love, sex, religious faith, all the things that really matter to people. And so I think, understanding tattooing, it's particularly in its images, gives us a little insight into people whose stories aren't told in many other ways in history.
No, I love the way you phrase that, because I can definitely relate to some of the aspects of the things you said. Specifically, something that's always stuck with me is that generally we talk about art and pain as something that's very, very attached, either pain or art and love, regardless of what end you go to. And yet, when we talk about tattoos, the fact that you're inflicting pain in order to get this piece of work is often overlooked, not as art, but as something else, as sometimes even a negative trait.
Right.
And that is very strange when we consider how we view art and what we consider an artist generally in society.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. One of the tattooists I write a lot about, who was a guy called Sutherland MacDonald, who was like the first kind of really professional tattooer in Britain. Not necessarily the first person, obviously not the first person to be to tattoo, but certainly the first person to kind of have to have a sort of particular premises for tattooing and to sort of present himself to the world as a tattooist. He claimed to have invented the word tattooist, in fact, because tattooing sounded too much like plumber or bricklayer. So he wanted to be tattooist, tattoo artist.
That makes sense.
Yeah, but he used to offer his clients cocaine injected to the tattoo site as an anaesthetic, right? So people would say, he would say, well, don't worry about the pain. I'll give you some cocaine injected. And one journalist went, well, I was only getting a small tattoo, and Mr. McDonald told me I didn't need the cocaine, but I got it anyway. Felt really good. So, I think actually the physical pain is a big part of the story, and it's a part of the story that confuses people who don't get tattooed. I don't think it's necessarily a massive part of the story for people who are getting tattooed.
Exactly, yeah.
And, I mean, that varies from person to person. I don't want to make a universal claim on that, but a lot of people, work with the pain, and it is an important part of the process. But it's not something they're actively seeking out. I think a lot of people who are, instinctively put off by tattooing are like, well, that hurts, I don't want to do it. And people who are getting tattooed are like, well, that hurts, I don't mind that it hurts, and I can deal with that for the eventual outcome. Some people, a very small number of people, are like, it hurts, that's why I do it, but that's not right.
No, I've never met anyone like that, actually. No, I've met people who don't care about the pain, or people who just don't feel any pain basically for it, but never someone who looks forward to it.
Oh, there are definitely a few, not many. There are definitely a few, but but I think what's interesting about the relationship between kind of emotional pain and physical pain in the context that you're talking about is actually it's much less clear than, as I said, there's, for example, one of the things that's been really interested some sociologists of tattooing recently has been like memorial tattooing. And one way that gets written about is like, well, it's a process of cathartic pain inscription, right? And I don't really believe that for the reasons you just identified. I don't think really anyone's seeking out. But the people who are writing about it academically are like, well, the pain must be a big part of the process. So, yeah, I think, and this is why it's important to actually try and break this moment. I think actually more important than the pain actually of the process of tattooing is the time duration, right? So you have to sit there for every second of your tattoo is being produced, right? So there's some kind of commitment to getting a tattoo, to buying a tattoo, to consuming a tattoo as an image that you just don't have if you're commissioning an artist in any other way or buying an artwork in any other way. And I think it's actually that kind of intimacy and that sort of time-based intimacy that's the most important thing, more than any kind of pain endurance that people who don't get it really kind of overblow.
No, I think that's true, and I think it's easy for someone who's already got a negative connotation or a negative idea about tattooing to pick all the things they think are the big issues with it, when actually that's just completely fabricated in their mind. They don't know how much a tattoo hurts. They've not got tattooed. They just built it up in their own mind.
That's a good point. I mean, the other one I alluded to earlier on, but is the what will you do when you're older question, right? Which is paradoxical when you actually think about it for more than a millisecond, which no one ever does. So that question implies the questioner is implying, like, oh my God, you're such a kind of slave to contemporary, whims. What's that idea? Tattoos are a temporary, permanent expression of a temporary feeling. Like, so goes the accusation.
Yeah.
So the accusation is like, well, you're just doing, and what will you do in the future when that moment passes? How dare you be such a slave to this present moment? But of course, the question also reveals their anxiety of like, oh my God, what will you do when you're not in the moment, when you're not fashionable anymore, right? So they're both worried about you being in the moment and not being in the moment at the same time, and you can't really win. Because if you sort of say, well, I don't, actually the whole point is I'm breaking this link with time, it's like, oh, wow, I can't handle that. And it's really paradoxical and really weird, but it's exactly that anxiety. And I think you're right when you say about I don't know how much it hurts. The questions that non-tattooed people ask about tattoos reveal their own anxieties, not anything that really makes sense to people who are tattooed.
That's so true. And I think something that is interesting with what we've talked about, we've mentioned all the sort of maybe heavier side of what people get tattooed on them.
Right.
But we haven't really touched on the light and more comedy side, which I've read some of your interviews. I know that there's a lot of examples throughout history of people using tattoos in order to tell a joke or a kind of meme or anything like that. Can you maybe give some of these examples for our listeners?
Oh yeah, I mean, this is sort of as you said. You know, when people who don't get this stuff right about it, it's all very earnest. But actually, when you pay attention, it tends to be really funny. So a few that spring to mind. One, are you okay with swearing on this podcast?
Absolutely, yes.
So one was during World War II. Quite a few soldiers or sailors, when they had to salute, got "fuck the Navy" tattooed on the outside of their saluting hand. So when you had to salute, you were both you were disrespecting the occasion. There was a guy who one of the tattooists who I write about tattooed some socks on him, and then he told the story of the guy getting hit by some shrapnel, and then he had to come back and get his sock darned. Right, got some darning put in. I mean, there was in my exhibition we had in the initial iteration of it, we had some preserved tattooed skins on display from the Wellcome collection, which were collected in 1924, and we had in there a pair of eyes. So an eye, like two pieces of skin, each with an eye tattooed on them, and they were basically some guy's ass. He got an eye tattooed either side of his butthole, and you know, 100 and odd years later, there's his gag that he thought was funny for his mates, that he could pull his trousers down, you know, and show off his bum. Is still amusing people 120 years later.
I thought that was wonderful when I read that. It was so good.
And the other one, the last one that was actually quite interesting in a historical context was very, very common back piece amongst sort of the hunting, shooting, fishing set. So the first real big scale tattoos being done in this country, kind of back pieces, were done on, as we've alluded to, kind of wealthy people. And a lot of the things they were into were, the things they were getting tattooed were reflected the things they were into. So a lot of them were into kind of country sports and things like that. So there's a lot of duck hunting back pieces. But the real kind of common gag one was a fox hunt tattoo, right? Where you got a whole tattoo of the fox and the hounds and the horses, and then you'd get the fox's tail just tattooed coming out of your bum cheek, so it looked like the beard down the hole. And that was actually mentioned when they were trying to make tattooing illegal. When they did make tattooing illegal under 18 in this country in 1969. That was mentioned in the House of Lords, because some of the members of the House of Lords were like, well, tattooing is disgraceful and it shouldn't be allowed. And someone stands up and says, there's a member of this House, a member of the House of Lords, who has a back piece, and it is of a hunt scene. And that was a guy called Lord Beresford, who'd been aide de camp to George V, and he had a massive fox hunt back piece with the gag fox around the hole. So still works, still funny.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned when the law changed for under 18s. Did that affect the art and the type of art that was being tattooed? As in, did under 18s start tattooing themselves or tattooing differently in order to get over it?
So the law was actually a response to apparently some a kind of craze, quote unquote, of young people doing it. So there's quite a lot of nice images in the press, in the press archive, if you go look for them, of like 12 and 13 and 14-year-olds who are tattooing themselves in the mid-60s. Yeah. I think what does happen in that moment is that the industry does start to get more professional, actually. I mean, as I said earlier on, the 50s in Britain was a pretty dark time for tattooing. It was really the low ebb of its social context. But even then, there were some tattooers, particularly a guy called Les Scoot, who tattooed in Bristol, who was really trying to elevate, and to keep tattooing kind of in the public eye as an art form, to for want of a better phrase. So he was really pushing that through the 50s. 1972, he did the first public art show of tattooing in Britain at Camden Art Gallery. And I think in the 70s, you do start to see tattooing change slowly but surely, into something a lot more recognisably modern. So we do start seeing, hygiene standards kick in a way that they hadn't really kicked in before. I mean, that's a complicated story, but roughly. So I mean, yeah, we do see a sort of slight push for professionalism. I mean, actually, one of the things that does happen, interestingly, in the 70s in this country is actually a lot of tattooers. Tattooing becomes quite defensive and quite protective. So a lot of tattooers, for example, won't tattoo hands, won't tattoo faces, some because they want to kind of protect the image of their own profession. But what that does, as you as you alluded to, is sort of spark up some kind of counter process. And actually, a lot of the skinhead tattooing and all the kind of facial tattooing and really kind of rough tattooing of the late 70s, early 80s was exactly a response actually to the sort of professionalization of the tattoo industry in a younger generation, and a sort of a more punk, a more kind of anarchic generation coming through and trying to break those quite conservative traditions that had developed over the past decade and a half by that point, and break them down.
Yeah, that's really tough. And in the aftermath of that, with someone like yourself obviously studying and becoming an academic in this kind of field, did you get any sort of clashes with that? Because obviously tattooing by that point was something that was a bit of a anti-system.
Yeah, I mean,
if that makes any sense.
Yeah, it's been so. I gave an interview yesterday or last week to a journalist in the US because there's a big exhibition that's just come out of the work of Ed Hardy, and he really, I think, was the kind of nexus point for tattoo art, tattoo culture, the tattoo community and academia meeting together. Particularly because, he had been taught to tattoo by an academic, right? So a guy called Samuel Stewart, who tattooed under the name of Phil Sparrow, he was an English professor at DePaul University in Chicago in the 1930s. And he basically was very, very gay. Amazingly, sort of brilliantly, perversely, joyously in the 1930s when it was illegal. And anyway, as he got older, he found it harder and harder to pick up the kind of guys that he was really looking to meet. And he figured that the best way to do that, the best way to meet the kind of hot sailor boys that he wanted to fuck, was to tattoo them.
I need to read into this. This is great.
Yeah, there's a biography of him called The Secret Historian by a guy called Justin Spring, which is his life story. And so basically, he taught English literature during the term time, and in the summertime he tattooed sailor boys.
Yeah.
And he became really interested in the history of tattooing. He was importing books about tattooing from Japan, and he just so happened to be one of the earliest mentors of Ed Hardy, who went on to start what looks like the first public-facing tattoo magazine, who started getting academics like Alan Governor to write about tattooing, who himself wrote about tattooing in a fairly academic way, and that's in the late 70s, early 80s. So, and people like Cliff Raven in the US as well, who'd been to art school, Mr. Sebastian in the UK, basically academics and artists have always sort of been in and around tattooing in a weird way. But you're right to say there certainly was a suspicion, and continues to be, rightly so, because a lot of people of my profession aren't that. They're not people who are getting tattooed, being tattooed, who are immersed in the tattoo community. They're people who are bored doing whatever it is they're doing normally, and are like, oh, I'm a bit bored of whatever it is I'm doing. I'm gonna do some tattooing for a bit, write about tattooing for a bit, or they're writing about something different. They're writing about identity or biography or skin or something, or criminality, and so they sort of do tattooing as a bit of a side thing, and then they can't access the material. They have a particular problem talking about it. And so tattooists are really skeptical because they've heard that all before. Phone rings, email comes in. Hi, I think you're weird. Can I come and interview you? And so luckily, I mean, it's been hard work, and it continues to be hard work. And I have to be, and I want to be very careful about how I walk these lines. But luckily, because I was a tattoo collector, tattoo fan first, and an academic second, I hope I'm able to bridge those gaps in a way that I'm not unique in doing that, but it's certainly, it's not been the standard pattern for academics. And I hope my work's better for it. I mean, I certainly think the curatorial work that I've done, the access to the objects I'm able to get, given that I'm aware of where they are. I mean, again, I think a lot, come back to what you said earlier on about misunderstandings and why they continue. A lot of it is because a lot of the material that would be needed to tell the story properly just isn't anywhere that anyone in my profession normally can access. There's not much in libraries, there's not much in archives, there's not much in museums. It's all in the community, it's all in private collections. And if you aren't tapped into that, you're just never going to be able to see it. Never be able to even know it exists.
I find it incredibly refreshing to talk to you, because I've got to say my honest reaction at the start if I see someone at a university talking about tattoos was exactly what you said. Is this someone who's not into tattoos at all? Is this someone who's actually going to be quite negative about tattoos because they're coming at it from a prejudice towards this stuff? Those are all the questions that generally come to my mind at the forefront. And yet that's what we need to break down, because obviously education is one of the most important things if we want to move ahead as a society.
I just think this stuff's cool, right? Like, I'm very lucky. I mean, extraordinarily fortunate that my job is basically to go, hey, everybody, look how cool this stuff is.
It's literally that. Yeah.
Yeah, and I still have a kind of childlike excitement about everything that I'm interested in. I mean, just literally this weekend, I managed to get some photos of something I've been looking for a very long time, which was the toy catalogue, which sold tattoo machines about 100 years ago, right?
Ah, great.
None of which are in museums, none of which are anywhere. There's very few in private collections around the world that I've been aware of. But if you're an academic trying to write about that stuff, you never would have found it or even known it existed. But of course, the very fact that tattoo machines were sold, on the high street in London 120 years ago, starts to tell a different kind of story about the history of tattooing that people imagine. And so that kind of material culture history stuff really, really changes the story. And it's that I want to do, because I think it's cool. Like the other example, that I always love is showing people images of tattooing from the 17th century. 100 years before, 100 years before Captain Cook's voyages, when quote-unquote tattooing was discovered in the Pacific. If you go, oh look, here's an engraving of someone with a full sleeve of religious tattoos done in Jerusalem in 1650.
Yeah.
But just that one image, you haven't even got to do any conversation. You just go, look at that date. And it's like, oh my God, everything I thought I knew about this practice is wrong. So yeah, it's having the kind of mindset and the willingness to do the work to find the images and find the material that enables us to tell the story differently. And of course, like, just to finish that thought, it also works the other direction, because I'm also able, and I love doing talks and speaking to tattoo industry crowds, because I'm also able to help them, help people who work in the industry understand the history of their own practice differently. There's always this conversation. I learn so much and continue to learn so much from tattooers, particularly tattoo collectors, and hopefully I'm able to contribute with my own efforts and my own work, so things that I've found and uncovered and discovered, and together our own understanding of this whole amazing magical set of histories grows, right?
That's the thing, and I think that the conversation is transcendent as well, because we're not just talking about tattoos.
Yeah.
When you do what you say and you show someone a photo and they question everything they knew about that subject,
right,
it's not just that subject that they start to question. Yeah. They start to question the politics they're reading in that same newspaper. They start to question everything they've been told they need to now go and double check, because if that's wrong, why shouldn't something else
Yeah,
be?
absolutely. Exactly right. And I've done talks at skeptics in the pub and things like that for that exact reason, because I think it's so. I mean, it's so interesting to me when I see these like newspaper articles that are like, oh, like tattooing's this hot new thing, and I sort of send them the same art. I've stopped doing it now. I'm a bit older, but I used to send journalists examples of that. Saying, someone else wrote this article 100 years ago, and you're right. It does make us think about the world differently. I mean, it's also complicated because, like. The media narrative to try and unpick the quote unquote truth, the real story from the media narrative is really, really complicated and almost impossible. And it takes quite a lot of effort and work. And, and the fact that we're never ever going to properly untangle that, we're never really going to know exactly what happened. And there's still mystery and there's still confusion, and that's why I'm doing my job, and why I think it's cool, because it's like, oh my god, like we're never going to 100% know exactly what was happening until someone invents a time machine. But that's exciting. That's what's great, and I'm always thrilled to learn. I was for years I said like I was saying that Southern McDonald Studio is the first publicly listed studio, first one, and to a degree that is true. He was the first visible guy. But then I found a couple of years earlier, just tucked away in the Cardiff Street directory, a little mention of a Cardiff tattooer. So, oh, okay, amazing. That changes the story. Same true of women. Women. The story of women in tattooing is really interesting, and we're finding out all the time now. Partly because I and others are doing focusing a bit more energy on it. We're finding loads more stories of, untold stories of the women of tattooing, whose stories have really been untold and understood. But we're finding, amazing women who are, or names of women, whether they were amazing, I don't know, but certainly the names of women who were tattooing, right back again into the 19th century. So, yeah, endless amount of stories still to tell, but, and maybe some of them will stick in the public consciousness. I don't know. We'll see.
I'm sure they will. It must be really exciting. It's really exciting to have to go back through that stuff and still be finding new things constantly and new information. And to me, as I look back at me being a young kid, and I think of the idea of a historian or a scientist, and it was all about discovering something new, not repeating the same thing.
Well, I mean, in a way, so some of the stuff that I found, I mean, it's in a way where there are things in public collections. I mean, I found, for example, a whole cache of images in the National Archives that took a lot of work. Like, it was a couple of weeks of quite complicated work with the help of a research assistant. The researcher was helping me out. We were going through big Victorian ledgers, and none of it was catalogued individually. So we were looking at handwriting, and it wasn't alphabetized, because it was just, they got logged in the registers as they got submitted. And anyway, after about 2 weeks, we found these photos, and they'd been there. They'd been in the National Archives for 100 and odd years, or 120 years or something, and no one had found them, because no one had bothered looking, even though this particular artist is MacDonald again, right? Even though MacDonald people knew him, he'd been written about a little bit, no one had bothered to go and just spend that time to go and find the material history. And, and we found it. I mean, now, annoyingly, after I found them and paid for them to get photographed, they're now on the National Archives catalogue, so you can... so they're now easily findable for anyone who wants to find them. I mean, that's a good thing in a way. But
just a bit of a slap in the face.
Well, yeah, I mean, yeah, it's okay. I'm to share the information, not to hide it away. Right? I'm glad that it's now accessible to people. But it was kind of amazing to me, and quite revealing that no one had really ever bothered to go and do this work before, and yeah, it's interesting. I mean, the other nice thing actually is that with the internet, with digitized, particularly newspaper archives for other kinds of records too, this kind of research is getting easier, and we're getting a much bigger picture. So, for example, there's a project that I'm not actually involved with, but it's really exciting. That's a digitization record of convicts records by some colleagues. I don't know what university they're at, but there is basically a big project underway to do this, and in that is lots of tattoo records. And of course, like, I got an email from the guy who's running the project going, I don't know what any of this means. Like, how do I unpick what this means? So I'm going to hopefully be talking to them later in the week to try and figure out what I can learn from this big new corpus of tattoo imagery that's been described. You know, what I'm really looking for. So one of the reasons that tattooing has been understood, principally as this kind of criminal practice and sailor practice is because if you're an academic and you go looking for tattooing in an archive where academics normally go looking for stuff, you will find tattoos written about or logged on the bodies of sailors in sailor records and on the bodies of criminals in prison records. Right? Not quite normal people, middle class people, working class people's tattoos are not recorded systematically.
Yeah. Who logs at bankers' tattoos? No one.
Yeah, exactly. Right. No one's writing those down and putting them in. So what I'm hoping that this convict record will reveal, if we look at the imagery, not just the fact that these people were arrested, is some kind of broader vernacular tattooing. So we can look for things like occupational tattoos, baker's tattoos, blacksmith tattoos, that kind of thing, to try and get a sense of how much wider tattooing was in culture than we've previously suspected.
Yeah. So the last thing I want to touch on, which ties into what you've just mentioned, is the amount of work that goes into this research, but also the amount of work and practical issues that come in to put in an exhibition on, like the one you had, the British tattoo art revealed.
Yes.
What you've mentioned some of them, but what are other of the issues that are involved in something like this? Because it must be pretty difficult, especially when you're acquiring preserved tattoo human skins and things like that.
Yeah. So obviously, Samuel Stewart, who I just mentioned, he did actually write an academic book about tattooing a long time ago called "Bad Boys and Tough Tattoos," which basically concludes, unsurprisingly for him, that tattoos are all about sex. I mean, they were for you, Sammy, but maybe not for everybody. But in that, he says tattoos are for life plus 6 months, right? Like they rot away. They rot away in the ground. So the very sort of fact of like preserving tattoos and having them around to be able to to be able to put on display is a problem. We have to find creative ways around that. When we have done, we've commissioned silicone arms to be tattooed, and we use photography and drawing and all those kind of things. We also, there's also the issue that the community is very skeptical about institutions, and I think that's the hardest part of my job. I mean, it's the most pleasurable because I built up some really great relationships with some really amazing people, but to try and convince people who are very skeptical of museums to lend their material to a museum tour for 4 years is difficult. They have collectors in general, not just tattoo collectors, but collectors in general have a different kind of attitude to stuff than museums do. Museums keep stuff and want to show it off. Collectors often quite like the feeling that no one's seen what they've got.
Yeah.
So that's an interesting problem, and takes a lot of my energy in trying to kind of negotiate what people are comfortable with and what people are happy with, and particularly because sometimes the objects that I want to borrow are the objects they're least willing to let out of their site every year.
Of course.
I have to. I have to deal with my own preconceptions and things like my own misconceptions, and I've had to be really careful. As I said, when I started out doing this, when I was doing my PhD, I was like, tattoos are great, tattoos are brilliant, aren't they always great? And then you realise that actually, it's more complicated than that. And we have to tell some stories of some dark sides and some problems and some complexities. So it's a real combination of the material history, the kind of culture of the industry and the culture of tattooing, and just my own kind of limitations as an academic and as a storyteller. But I really hope that I'm sort of squaring the circles as best I can, and hopefully. And not just me. There's a group. There's a nice group of us now around the world of tattoo academics who are about of my generation. Most of us working on different areas. We don't tend to tread on each other's toes, but as such, we're building as a little network of tattoo scholars. We're building up a really, really nice and exciting set of stories. And of course, like the best history work is coming out of the tattoo community. There are people in the tattoo industry now who are very untrained to most degrees, but very, very capable historians and writers who are who have even better access to material than I do, and who are self-publishing books, and who are doing amazing work.
That's amazing.
So it's a really exciting time. And we're all in this legacy of Ed Hardy in a way, but I think that thing that he started, which was let's just make this stuff visible, talk about it, not disrespect it, understand its cultural context. That kind of pattern is still, I think, really important.
Yeah. Matt, I have really, really enjoyed talking to you.
Thank you very much.
It's been such a pleasure. Is there anything that you're working on or anything that you'd like to plug before we quit it?
Yeah, the exhibition is closed for the summer, but it's opening again October 2019 to March 2020 in Yarmouth at Time and Tide Museum. March 2020 to June 2020, it's in Chatham. And then after that, it's got a few more stops into 2021. So if anyone wants to go and see the exhibition, 400 years of British tattoo history with over 400 objects, it's on in Yarmouth from October.
That is great. I will get any links I need off you and link everything in the description to the podcast as well, so that everyone can check it out.
Come and study art history. Art history or curating, MA or BA at the University of Essex. Wants to come and hang out with me, just drop me an email or find me online.
Thank you so much, Matt.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure. We're generally, as a species, pretty bad at looking past the end of our noses and understanding what's going on.
Thank you so much for checking out that episode of the podcast. I really, really appreciate your time, and I hope you enjoyed the conversation, because for me, it was really a wonderful experience to have Dr. Matt Lodder on the show. And please, if you did enjoy it, do us a favor. Give it a like, give us a follow, subscribe, leave us a rating. It all depends on where you're listening from, but it all does really, really help. And if there's anything more important than that, it's to give us your feedback, because I would really love to know what you think of the show, how I can improve it. I know it might come across as a bit harsh to tell someone that they need to change something, but at the end of the day, nothing will improve unless I hear it from you. I will just keep on making the same mistakes. So yeah, let me know how you're feeling about the show. Let me know what I should be doing differently. And as always, thanks for listening.
We're generally, as a species, pretty bad at looking past the end of our noses and understanding what's going on.